Around 5:15 p.m. on Sunday, May 22, 2011, 16-year-old Stephen Weersing was riding in the passenger seat of his friend Johnny's car as they barreled through the streets of Joplin, Missouri. It was a perfect spring day. They had the windows rolled down, and their friend Dylan, who was in the back seat, was singing along to the Blink-182 song that was blasting from the radio. And as they drove, Stephen stuck his right arm out the window to feel the wind, and as he did, he admired the tattoo that ran the length of his right forearm. The tattoo spelled Stephen's last name in a style that sort of looked like graffiti. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, and although he loved it, his parents did not, and they were still upset that he had actually gotten it. But Stephen didn't really care. Stephen turned around and asked Dylan to pass up the bag of potato chips they'd just bought at the store. Dylan took one more handful and then thrust the bag forward, and as Stephen grabbed the bag, big raindrops began hitting the windshield. Johnny quickly rolled up the windows, and when Stephen looked outside, he noticed the sky had gone from, slightly overcast to now very dark gray. Stephen instinctively turned down the volume on the radio and then said to his friends that it looked like a serious storm was coming. Johnny nodded and said he would start driving back to his house in South Joplin where they could all wait out the storm together. But just 5 minutes later, as Johnny weaved through the back roads of the small city, the drizzling rain became a full-on downpour, and strong winds began to shake the car. Stephen leaned close to the windshield, trying to see through the heavy rain smashing into it to try to help his friend find the correct turn. But then something bounced off the window right in front of Stephen's face, startling him and causing everybody in the car to gasp. Stephen quickly realized that they were all kind of overreacting. It was just a stick that had hit the windshield, and for a second, Stephen wanted to laugh. But then all three boys heard off in the distance the ominous sound of a tornado siren, loud and clear even through the pounding rain. Growing up in a part of the country that's sometimes called Tornado Alley, Stephen and his friends had been through their fair share of tornadoes, and so they'd heard these sirens before. Normally, storms didn't really scare Stephen, but he could already tell that this tornado, was different. It had come on with almost no warning, and now more sticks and rocks were beating the sides of the car, and the gray sky had taken on a sickly orange tint. Johnny, who was white-knuckling the steering wheel at this point, turned to Stephen and Dylan and said, "Hey, we're almost at my house. I'm going to try to outrun the storm." And then Johnny hit the gas, turned right, and the rain actually suddenly stopped. For a moment, all Stephen and his friends could hear was just the urgent wail of the tornado siren. But then this overwhelmingly loud rumbling noise like a jet engine made Stephen suddenly cover his ears. And then pieces of cement and plywood began crashing into the car, this time shattering the passenger side window and filling the car with broken glass. Stephen turned to his friends, absolutely terrified, and he could see from all their looks that they were scared too. And then Stephen realized that the reason the rain had just stopped for a second is because Johnny had just unknowingly driven directly into the path of the tornado. But now there was basically nothing they could do. Johnny continued to try to drive, but the car began to shake harder and harder, and then Stephen felt the entire vehicle literally rise off the ground until none of the wheels were touching the road. Stephen and the others did their best to try to shield their bodies from all the debris flying through the broken window, but as the car began to spin faster and faster in midair, Stephen felt the wind pulling him out of the car. He screamed and his friends grabbed his legs, frantically trying to keep him inside. And then, as suddenly as the car had risen off the ground, it came smashing back down onto the street, landing on its roof and throwing the three teenagers out onto the street. But the tornado was not finished with them yet. Stephen's friends gripped the car to brace themselves against the strong winds, but Stephen had fallen further away from the vehicle, and he was again swept back up into the swirling vortex, this time with no car around him to protect him. Stephen watched as his friends grew smaller and smaller as Stephen was sucked farther up into the air. For just a moment, Stephen was acutely aware of the roaring wind and the debris pummeling him from all sides, and then everything went black. On the other side of town, Stephen's father, David, listened to the weather report on TV while he made sure all of his windows were shut and locked. The meteorologist said that a giant, mile-wide tornado was wreaking havoc on the southern part of Joplin, with winds blowing over 200 miles per hour. But even people who lived further north, like David, should still take cover. Just then, David's landline phone rang, and when he picked it up, he heard his ex-wife, Carissa, speaking, and she sounded very concerned. She asked David if he had heard from either of their sons. Ever since David and Carissa had gotten divorced, the couple shared custody of their kids, and both boys were staying at David's house that weekend. Carissa said she'd been trying to get in touch with the boys to warn them about the tornado, but she couldn't get in touch with them. Neither of them were answering their phones. David told Carissa that he had spoken to their younger son, Nathan, and he was safe, but he hadn't heard from Stephen all weekend, which was actually normal, because at the time, Stephen was going through a rebellious phase. Stephen and his dad had gotten into a big argument after Stephen decided to drop out of high school, and lately, Stephen would leave home for days at a time without telling anyone where he was, and he would do the exact same thing when he was staying at his mother's house. But David knew, despite all that, Stephen had a good heart, and he wouldn't just ignore his parents' phone calls when they just wanted to know that he was safe. So David told Carissa he would try to get in touch with Stephen. So David hung up and then used his cell phone to call and text Stephen. He didn't get a response, and as the rain and wind picked up outside and the tornado sirens continued to blare, David started to worry. He told himself that, Stephen was probably at one of his friends' houses, but Stephen had buddies all over the city. What if he'd been visiting someone in South Joplin, in the tornado's path? But there really wasn't anything David could do. With the storm outside, David basically just had to stay home and wait it out before he went out looking for his son. 30 minutes later, David was glued to the news, and the meteorologist finally reported that the tornado in South Joplin had passed and it was now safe for people to go outside. David still had not been able to contact Stephen, so as soon as he heard the all clear, he grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. David planned to drive to the two hospitals in Joplin to check if Stephen was at either one. And as he drove, David felt a bit of relief seeing that his neighborhood was still in good shape. There was debris here and there, and a few thin trees had snapped in half, but nobody's houses or cars were severely damaged. However, David's relief turned to anxiety as he drove further south, where the tornado had actually touched down, and he saw the widespread devastation. To David, it looked like a giant had stomped right on top of the town. Houses were flattened into piles of wood and brick, power lines had collapsed, battered cars and trucks were littered all over the streets, creating roadblocks that were nearly impossible to pass. David turned on the car radio to see what the local news station was saying about the storm, and a reporter came on and said the tornado had been categorized as an EF5, which is the highest on the scale. Thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, hundreds of residents were injured, and dozens of people had already been found dead. David fought hard to keep his anxiety at bay, praying that Stephen had not been in this area when the tornado had come through. Finally, David reached St. John's Regional Medical Center, and he was horrified to see that the huge multi-story building had been decimated too. An entire side of the hospital was now gone, and David could see first responders running in and out of the building, hustling survivors out. And so David just turned and began driving toward Joplin's other hospital called Freeman Health System. As he pulled into the parking lot, David was relieved to see that Freeman was still standing. And so he parked his car in the lot and then ran inside. Entering Freeman Hospital was like walking into a nightmare. The emergency room was crowded with people who'd been injured, some quite badly. David saw one man who had a bloody, obviously broken leg, and there was a woman with shards of glass literally sticking out of her arms and chest. He could hear children crying and the muted sounds of an ambulance pulling up outside. And at least a dozen people were lined up in front of the reception desk, all new patients waiting to be checked in. David didn't want to waste valuable time waiting in that line, so he just started walking around the lobby asking random hospital employees if they'd seen a skinny 16-year-old boy with dark shaggy hair. But everyone he talked to said no. But just then, a doctor came out of the doors that led to the emergency room, and her blue scrubs were stained with blood, and she looked completely overwhelmed. But David just sprinted right up to her and asked her the same question. Hey, have you seen my son? He's 16, he's got scraggly hair, he's skinny, and he also has a big tattoo on his right forearm. When the doctor heard this, in particular the right forearm tattoo comment, the doctor's expression changed, and she told David to please follow her. And she led him through the chaotic hallway and into a room where a teenage boy was lying unconscious on a bed with a breathing tube inserted directly into the front of his neck. His face was so badly injured that David didn't actually recognize him. But then the doctor walked over to the boy and gently lifted up the boy's right arm and showed David the tattoo. and when David saw it, he knew immediately he'd found his son. The doctor said a good Samaritan had brought Stephen and one of his friends to the hospital, and Stephen apparently had been riding around with 2 other teenage boys when their car had been sucked up into the tornado. The other 2 teenagers were okay, but Stephen was not. He was in terrible shape. He had a serious head injury, several cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep, open wound on his abdomen that left the right side of his rib cage totally exposed. But despite all his injuries, the doctor said that hospital staff had been able to stabilize him. And so right now, the doctor said he was doing basically as well as he could be, and they hoped he would just continue to improve. David was shocked and horrified and heartbroken to hear what his son had gone through, but the doctor at least sounded somewhat optimistic, which made David hopeful too. And so David thanked the doctor and then called Stephen's mother, Carissa, to tell her the bad news. 5 days later, Carissa sat beside her son's hospital bed, wishing that Stephen could talk to her. The doctors were keeping him in a medically induced coma so that his brain could heal from his traumatic head injury. But Carissa spoke to him anyway, telling him that she loved him and that he was strong. And she wanted to believe that her son could hear her because he did seem to be doing better. Some of Stephen's bruises were lightening up, and the smaller scrapes and cuts he had were starting to heal as well. But one side of his face was still covered in a thick scab, and Carissa had not yet dared to look beneath the huge white bandage that stretched from her son's belly button up to his right armpit. Carissa reached out to hold Stephen's hand, and she noticed that his fingers looked bigger than usual, like they were swollen. Carissa got up and walked to the other side of his bed, and she saw that his other hand looked swollen too. A few minutes later, when a nurse came in to check on Stephen, Carissa asked about Stephen's hands. The nurse looked closely and said the swelling in his hands might be caused by an infection inside of his body. The nurse did not seem that concerned, but she told Carissa she would ask the doctor to get Stephen started on a course of antibiotics right away, which should help his body fight off this infection. Carissa nodded and gave the nurse a weak smile like she was okay with this answer, but inside, she had no idea what kind of infection caused a person's hands to swell up so much. But the nurse did not seem like she had any time for questions. She was already rushing out of the room. Carissa knew the doctors and nurses were doing their best, but they were clearly overworked, and it worried her that they hadn't noticed these signs of Stephen's potential infection. But Carissa just felt glad that she was at least there to look after her son and make sure his medical team didn't miss anything. And so she and David agreed to coordinate their schedules so that at least one of them was always by Stephen's side. On June 1st, so 3 days after Stephen's antibiotic treatment began, Carissa and David were sitting beside each other on the small couch in Stephen's room when a doctor walked in. He had a grave expression on his face as he told the parents that the antibiotics did not seem to be working. In fact, the swelling in Stephen's hands had only gotten worse. And now he was also running a fever, and his blood pressure kept jumping and then plummeting. The doctor said that with every passing hour, Stephen's condition was getting less and less stable. And the doctor admitted that the hospital didn't have the resources to take care of Stephen at the moment. They were struggling just to find beds for all the patients who'd been injured during the tornado. The doctor said that what Stephen really needed was a team of doctors who had the time and space to care for him properly. So they suggested having Stephen airlifted 150 miles north to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. The doctor promised Stephen would get better, more specialized care there than he could in Joplin. For the parents, this was not even a question. Of course they would take Stephen wherever he needed to go to get better. So just a few minutes later, Carissa watched as medical staff loaded her still unconscious son into a medical helicopter, and then David jumped in after him and gave Carissa a hesitant wave goodbye. Carissa backed away and watched as the helicopter took off and began its journey, and then Carissa headed out to the parking lot, got into her car, and began the long drive north to Kansas City. That same afternoon, at the Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a pediatric infectious disease specialist named Dr. Marianne Jackson stepped into the room where her newest patient had just arrived. Dr. Jackson, who was a very energetic woman, had decades of experience treating children with unidentified infections, which made her the perfect person to take care of Stephen. She'd already been briefed on his condition, so when she went into his room, she was not surprised to see him laying there unconscious with a breathing tube down his throat. Dr. Jackson introduced herself to Stephen's father, who was in the room, and she explained that she was here to figure out what was causing his son's hands to swell up. And then Dr. Jackson walked over to Stephen and looked at his hands, which were definitely still very swollen, but she couldn't see any open wounds on his hands or wrists where an infection could develop. And so Dr. Jackson began to check out the rest of Stephen's injuries. The scabs on his face were healing well, and so too were the cuts and bruises on his arms and legs. That just left Stephen's biggest wound, the one on his abdomen, which was currently covered by a huge white bandage. Dr. Jackson carefully removed that bandage, and even though the doctors from Freeman Health System had warned her about the severity of Stephen's injury, she still was not prepared for what she saw. His entire side was exposed. The skin, fat, and muscle that would normally protect his ribcage had all been ripped away. And then Dr. Jackson noticed that sort of surrounding this horrible wound on his abdomen was this weird, shiny black material that almost looked like patent leather. Dr. Jackson recognized this as dead tissue. Whatever infection Stephen had, it was causing the skin and muscle around the wound to die and turn black. Dr. Jackson knew that this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Dead tissue can be a breeding ground for all kinds of dangerous bacteria, plus it stops wounds from healing properly. Dr. Jackson explained to Stephen's father they would need to bring his son in for surgery immediately. All of that dead black tissue around Stephen's wound would need to be surgically removed as soon as possible. David looked uneasy, but he said, "Okay, whatever you have to do." And then he squeezed his son's hand and told him that he was strong and he was going to be okay. And then a nurse came in and wheeled Stephen away to be prepped for surgery. That evening, in the operating room, Dr. Jackson watched as a surgeon carefully removed sections of the thick black tissue from around Stephen's chest wound. The surgeon cut away as much dead tissue as he could find, but what was left behind didn't look very healthy either. Dr. Jackson could already tell that Stephen was almost certainly going to need another operation after this one. And so after the surgeon was done and began putting a fresh bandage over Stephen's chest, Dr. Jackson took samples of the dead tissue they'd removed and sent them to the hospital lab for analysis. 2 days later, Dr. Jackson was back in the operating room, standing next to the surgeon as he held a scalpel close to Stephen's chest. They had not received the results of tissue analysis from the lab yet, but when Dr. Jackson checked in on Stephen that morning, she realized she had been right. He definitely needed more surgery. Because not only was there more dying and blackened tissue surrounding Stephen's wound, but something even more disturbing was happening. Something that Dr. Jackson had never seen in over 25 years of practicing medicine. Looking down at Stephen's exposed ribs, Dr. Jackson and the surgeon both saw fuzzy black material growing on top of Stephen's bones and into his muscles. Dr. Jackson turned to the surgeon and said it sort of looked like mold. And so whatever infection Stephen had, it was clearly eating away at his flesh and also spreading throughout his chest cavity. And even though Stephen was on huge doses of antibiotics, this infection kept on growing at an alarming rate. Dr. Jackson watched as the surgeon carved away as much of the mold and dead tissue as he could. But still, Dr. Jackson knew this was not sustainable. With each surgery, they were chopping off more and more of Stephen's skin and muscle. And so they couldn't just keep doing that because that would eventually kill him. Plus, this infection appeared to just grow back anyway. But regardless, when the surgeon was finished and Stephen went back to the recovery room, Dr. Jackson briefed his parents about what she and the surgeon had found. She still didn't know what this infection was, but it was clearly very aggressive and was not responding to any of the medications the doctors had tried so far. Dr. Jackson swore she was going to do everything she possibly could to help their son, but she admitted it was going to take a miracle for their son to pull through this. David looked at the doctor with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't understand how this was happening. One moment, Stephen was a perfectly healthy kid. The next, he was injured in this freak tornado accident. And now his body was being ravaged by some kind of mysterious flesh-eating infection, and nobody could tell them what it was, how he got it, or how to help him. It just didn't make any sense. 10 days later, Dr. Jackson arrived for her shift at the hospital. She pulled on her white coat and walked down the hallway towards Stephen's room to check on him. But she was not feeling optimistic. Ever since Stephen's second surgery, his condition had just kept on getting worse. The tissue surrounding his wound was slowly dying, and as hard as the hospital staff had tried to keep his wounds clean, that fuzzy black mold just kept coming back. But just before she got to Stephen's room, a lab technician stopped her in the hallway and told her they'd finally gotten the results of Stephen's tissue analysis. This lab report did explain what was causing Stephen's life-threatening infection. And while Dr. Jackson was glad to finally have some answers, she knew that this diagnosis was not good news. The rare infection that was ravaging Stephen's body had less than a 20% survival rate, and the only treatment was absolutely brutal. Surgeons would need to cut every last bit of the infection out of his body. And so just a few hours later, Dr. Jackson was once again in the operating room with the same surgeon who had performed Stephen's first 2 surgeries. And as the surgeon sliced away mold and dead tissue, he suddenly turned to Dr. Jackson with a horrified expression on his face. Now, the mold was not just on Stephen's bones and in his muscles. Mold had also made its way into Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. In order to get this infection out of Stephen's body, the surgeon was going to have to remove parts of Stephen's vital organs. Dr. Jackson told the surgeon that they just didn't have any other choice. Stephen might die if he lost parts of these organs, but he would definitely die if the surgeon left any trace of the infection behind. So, the surgeon very carefully began to cut away moldy sections of Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. And when the surgery was over, Stephen had lost so much bodily tissue that Dr. Jackson could literally see his internal organs through the gaps in his ribs. She could see his lungs inflate and could see what was left of his heart still beating. And so even though Dr. Jackson wanted to remain optimistic, looking down at the mangled boy, she just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive this. 8 weeks later, in August of 2011, Stephen's mom, Carissa, was curled up on the fold-out bed in Stephen's hospital room, trying her best to relax. She had stayed there almost every night that summer, but she rarely got any sleep. Even after the doctors had removed parts of Stephen's vital organs, the infection kept coming back. And so Stephen had undergone 12 more surgeries to remove mold and dead tissue from inside of his chest. And then, a few days after Stephen's most recent surgery, Dr. Jackson had roused Carissa to tell her that for the first time, the mold had not come back. They had finally cured Stephen's infection. At first, Carissa wanted to celebrate, but then reality came crashing down on her. As doctors worked hard to save Stephen's life, his body had been damaged almost beyond repair. Despite this infection being gone, he might never wake up from his coma. And even if he did, at a minimum, he was going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries and years of physical therapy. And so that evening, thoughts about her son's uncertain future kept Carissa wide awake as usual. And so, needing a distraction, Carissa sat up, grabbed the TV remote, and flipped through the channels until she found MTV, Stephen's favorite channel. And then she sat upright on the hard fold-out bed and reached over to hold her son's hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw Stephen move. Carissa turned her head and looked at Stephen, and she saw that she was not mistaken. Stephen was blinking. His eyes were now wide open. For the first time since the tornado nearly 3 months ago, her son was awake. Stephen looked around the room, confused about where he was and what was happening, and then a moment later, he looked right at his mom, and she burst out laughing and crying at the same time, totally overcome with joy. The following morning, Dr. Jackson stood next to Stephen's hospital bed. Stephen's parents were both in the room, and they both looked happier and more energized than they had in months. Although Dr. Jackson had been treating Stephen since June, this was the first time she was really meeting him, and the shaggy-haired teenager had a lot of questions for her. He said that the last thing that he could remember was tumbling out of his friend's car and being pulled up into the tornado. He had no idea what happened after that. Dr. Jackson told him that the fact that he was alive was a miracle. She explained how terribly injured he'd been after the tornado, but that wasn't even the worst of it. After being hurt, he'd developed this infection that ate away at his skin, muscles, and organs, and very nearly killed him. This incredibly rare infection was called zygomycosis, and it was caused by a fungus that had invaded Stephen's body. The fungus blocked off his blood vessels, causing his skin and muscle tissue to die and rot. At the same time, it grew rapidly inside of his body, appearing as black mold on his ribs and in his muscles and organs. This fungus usually lives in water or underground, and it doesn't normally make people sick. However, during the devastating tornado, which killed over 150 people and injured thousands of others, this fungus had been swept up into the vortex. And after Stephen's chest was cut wide open, that fungus that was in the tornado was literally blown into his chest cavity, where it took hold and began multiplying quickly. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 12 other people who were affected by this tornado had also developed the same horrible infection as Stephen because they had open wounds and the fungus was blown inside of them. But Dr. Jackson actually told Stephen that compared to some of the other victims, he was one of the lucky ones. 5 of those 12 other people affected by this fungus had died. Stephen had to spend another 3 months in the hospital before he was healthy enough to go home. Even then, he underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and was left with a giant scar stretching from his belly button almost to his neck. But much like the tattoo he got when he was 16, Stephen feels like his huge tornado scar is an important part of his story because it shows how far he's come. After his battle with deadly fungal infection, Stephen decided to go back to school and finish his education. And today, he's a proud father to 4 young kids, and he couldn't be happier. Although, from time to time, he still has nightmares about the tornado that changed his life. A couple weeks before Thanksgiving in 2015, a woman named Cicely Odom Rose made her way along the buffet line of a holiday potluck party, loading up her plate with a little bit of everything. Once it was full, she carried it across the room to her 15-year-old daughter, Kennedy. Cicely and her daughter were best friends, and they bonded over their shared loves, like parties, their tight-knit family in Memphis, and of course, great home-cooked food. But when Cicely handed the plate of food to her daughter, Kennedy sort of waved the plate away, pointing at her jaw. Kennedy had just gotten her braces tightened the day before, and apparently they still hurt too much for her to chew. It would turn out both Kennedy and her mother, Cicely, had both gotten braces on their teeth at the same time back in February. But their dental journeys since then had been very different. Cicely didn't really mind or even notice the braces very much, but Kennedy found hers totally aggravating, and every time hers were tightened, she'd be in pain for days. Cicely handed Kennedy's plate of food to a family friend, and then took a seat next to her daughter. Cicely could see on Kennedy's face how disappointed she was. This annual family party was something she looked forward to every year. And so Cicely gave Kennedy a big hug and promised her she would feel better soon. Early the next morning, Cicely awoke to Kennedy knocking on her bedroom door. And when her daughter opened the door, she looked exhausted. And she told Cicely that she actually had barely slept all night because her head was throbbing so badly. Cicely grabbed a bottle of aspirin from her bedside table, shook a few pills into her hand, and gave them to Kennedy. Cicely told her daughter to take the pills and go back to bed. A little pain relief and rest could cure anything. But a couple of hours later, when Cicely poked her head into her daughter's room, she found Kennedy curled on her side with a pillow over her head, and she would tell her mother that the pills hadn't helped and her headache was still pounding. Cicely walked over to her daughter and placed the back of her hand against Kennedy's forehead to see if she was burning up. And she did feel slightly warm, but Cicely was now suddenly more worried about Kennedy's lips. They looked swollen and inflamed. She wondered if Kennedy might have caught some sort of bug or rash at the party. Cicely got an ice pack from the freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and had Kennedy hold it to her lips to try to reduce the swelling. Then she brought Kennedy some more aspirin and also fluffed up her pillows. But as she stood to leave, Cicely's heart broke to see her daughter in so much obvious discomfort. And so she made a mental note to plan something fun for Kennedy as soon as she was better. But the next morning, Kennedy had not improved at all. Cicely found her curled up in a fetal position under the covers, looking even weaker and more haggard after another bad night's sleep. Kennedy told her mother that in addition to all these symptoms she was feeling, that at some point in the previous night, her throat had also started to hurt, and now there was a stabbing pain every time she swallowed. And so at this point, Cicely decided enough was enough. She helped Kennedy get dressed and then guided her out to the car and drove her to the nearest clinic. After being shown to an exam room, a nurse gave Kennedy a checkup and swabbed her throat to run some tests. And while they waited, Cicely held her daughter close to her chest and rocked her back and forth, just like she had when she was a little girl. Cicely couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter this sick. I mean, her daughter looked hollowed out and wrecked. Cicely could tell that, whatever this was, it couldn't be normal. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Kennedy's doctor came inside, and he told them he had good and bad news. The bad news was that Kennedy had caught a bacterial infection called strep throat, which is very painful. It's like the worst sore throat you can get. But the good news was that if Kennedy took a few days of antibiotics, she would bounce right back. And so the doctor scribbled out a prescription, handed it to Cicely, and then told Kennedy she would feel better soon. But just a few days later, Cicely's car came to a stop in front of a hospital, and then she and her daughter went inside of the ER. Cicely told the doctor on duty about Kennedy's strep throat diagnosis and how she had been taking antibiotics for a few days without any signs of improvement. Then suddenly this morning, things went south. Kennedy woke up vomiting from pain, and sores had broken out all over the inside of her mouth. The doctor nodded and asked Kennedy to open up her mouth. And after she had, the doctor used a tongue depressor and flashlight and began examining the walls of her mouth and all around her tongue. Kennedy whimpered at the touch, and then eventually, at the end of the examination, the doctor swabbed one of Kennedy's sores and handed the sample to a nurse who took it to the lab. And then the doctor walked out of the exam room, leaving the mother and daughter alone. As Cicely stood behind Kennedy, stroking her hair, she wondered if the sores in her daughter's mouth might be some sort of complication from the antibiotics. Kennedy had never been allergic to medication as a child, but she knew that sometimes allergies don't develop until later in life. Either way, Cicely felt confident that the hospital would figure out what was going on with her daughter, and they would get her started on the right treatment. Eventually, the doctor returned, and he told Cicely that Kennedy was still testing positive for strep throat. However, her strep infection had nothing to do with the sores. He said that, most likely the sores were being caused by some sort of virus, but he wouldn't know for sure until they ran more tests. In the meantime, the doctor told Cicely that he wanted to rule out more serious possibilities, namely Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a rare but sometimes deadly skin disease. At hearing this, Cicely felt blindsided. She didn't understand how an ordinary case of strep throat could have anything to do with this potentially fatal condition the doctor was talking about. Cicely tried to keep her composure for her daughter's sake, but it was hard to act calm with news like this. Once the doctor left the room again, Cicely whipped out her phone and called Kennedy's godmother, Tamara. Tamara had always been a rock for Cicely's family. She was one of those people who just always seemed to know what to do in stressful situations. And so Cicely gripped her daughter's hand tightly as she explained to Tamara everything that had happened over the past few days. She told Tamara that she and Kennedy really needed her help because Kennedy's journey to recovery was starting to look like a rocky road. 3 months later, Cicely sat in another hospital room watching a doctor examine Kennedy's abdomen. She barely recognized her daughter's body anymore. Kennedy looked skeletal and frail, having lost more than 30 pounds in the past few months, and none of the doctors they had visited so far could figure out why. Now, Kennedy had stopped testing positive for the strep bacteria, but her other symptoms like sore throat, swollen lips, fevers, and various mysterious aches, those hadn't gone away. But worst of all the symptoms were the sores in Kennedy's mouth. They had only grown more painful and more sensitive until Kennedy finally just stopped being able to eat. Cicely had even asked Tamara to make her famous homemade chicken soup, which had always been Kennedy's favorite food, but the sores still hurt too much for her to even finish a small cup of it. And so day after day, Cicely watched her daughter get thinner and weaker until finally it got so bad that Kennedy had to stop going to school. She just didn't have the strength to make it through the day without going to bed. But not seeing her friends really only deepened Kennedy's depression. Cicely took Kennedy to every doctor and every specialist around Memphis, but they were all mystified by what could be causing her symptoms. And so today's appointment was for an ultrasound to try to get a clearer picture of Kennedy's organs. As the doctor moved the ultrasound wand along Kennedy's body, searching for anything unusual, Kennedy suddenly cried out in pain. She told the doctor that the area he had just touched felt like a knife was going into her side. The doctor quickly wheeled the ultrasound machine closer to Kennedy's bedside and then turned the screen so Cicely could see what he was seeing. Cicely couldn't quite tell what she was looking at on the screen since the image was grainy and pixelated, but the doctor kept his eyes glued to one spot as he carefully moved the wand up and down on Kennedy's body. Eventually, the doctor set the wand down, wiped the gel off of Kennedy's belly from the ultrasound machine, and pulled off his gloves. He told Cicely that what he'd just seen on the ultrasound was very worrisome. Kennedy's spleen looked very enlarged. Since the spleen is what filters blood and fights off infections, when it's not functioning properly, then the whole body is extremely vulnerable. Not only that, but most causes of an enlarged spleen are serious, from infections to anemia, and even to certain cancers like leukemia, which affects the blood and bones. The doctor apologized for not having better news, but it looked likely that Kennedy was up against something pretty severe. Cicely didn't even know how to react. She looked over at her poor daughter, who looked so small and defenseless lying on the bed, and she just couldn't understand why all these horrible things were happening to such a sweet and innocent girl. And so once the doctor left, Cicely pulled out her phone and hatched a new plan. It was time to stop waiting for a miracle. Days later, Kennedy's godmother, Tamara, knocked on the door of the Odom family home. Tamara took her role as godmother very seriously, and she, like Cicely, had been worried sick throughout Kennedy's ordeal. Tonight, Cicely had invited her over to discuss the whole situation and try to do some research. When Cicely opened the door, Tamara pulled her in for a big hug. She could see the stress all over Cicely's face. Tamara couldn't even imagine what it would be like to have one of her own children go through something this harrowing and sort of being helpless to stop it. Once inside the house, Tamara went ahead and poured 2 big glasses of wine and then followed Cicely to her computer. The women took turns searching medical forums for descriptions of cases that were similar to Kennedy's, but they didn't find anything that matched. And so eventually, Tamara asked Cicely to walk her through every detail of Kennedy's recent doctor's appointments while she made notes of everything. Tamara had a feeling that there had to be some clue staring them right in the face about what was going on with Kennedy. She just didn't know what it was yet. And so, before leaving, Tamara just told Cicely that she wanted to go wish Kennedy goodnight. And so she walked down the hall, knocked softly on Kennedy's door, and then went in and took a seat on the edge of her goddaughter's bed. And when she looked down at Kennedy, she was disturbed at how thin she looked. The girl used to be such a vibrant teenager, but now she was like a shell of herself. And then Tamara told Kennedy that as soon as her appetite came back, she would cook her a whole buffet of her favorite foods to try to put some meat back on her bones. Now, Tamara didn't say that to be a joke, but Kennedy sort of laughed and cracked a smile when she said it. But as Kennedy did, with her mouth wide open in full view of Tamara, suddenly a light bulb went off in Tamara's head. She didn't know how she would prove this, but she thought if she was right about her theory about Kennedy, it would explain everything. Tamara kissed Kennedy on the forehead and tucked her back in, and then slipped out the door to go share her new theory with Cicely. Now, Cicely was skeptical. To her, the idea was too obvious to be true. She found it impossible to believe that all of Kennedy's doctors would have overlooked something so simple. Tamara agreed with Cicely that it could be a long shot, but given all that Kennedy had gone through already, they owed it to her to follow every lead. And so Cicely nodded, thanked her friend, and told Tamara she'd do some more research. Weeks later, Cicely got a call from the hospital. They told her that a specialist had been assigned to Kennedy's case, a Dr. Mitchell Godat. When Dr. Godat had heard about Tamara's new theory that she had learned after looking at her goddaughter's mouth, it gave him an idea. He thought Kennedy's enlarged spleen indicated an allergic reaction, so he asked Cicely to bring Kennedy back to the hospital so they could test different allergens on her skin. And that hospital visit would accomplish what none of the others had been able to do: isolating the cause of Kennedy's symptoms. And the cause had been staring them all in the face since day one. When the doctors told Cicely, she was speechless. Once again, Tamara had been right. That night in Kennedy's bedroom, when Kennedy had sort of laughed at Tamara talking about putting meat in her bones, well, Tamara had looked down and noticed the girl's braces were reflecting in the light of the bedside lamp, which made her wonder, what if Kennedy's braces were the issue? And so Tamara had suggested this to Cicely, and then after Tamara went home that night, Cicely thought back and realized that all of Kennedy's health problems began after her daughter's braces were put in. And she also remembered that every time Kennedy had her braces tightened, she would complain of intense pain in her mouth, and the pain seemed to only get worse as time went on. Cicely had mentioned this to Kennedy's orthodontist the first time it happened, but he told her that for some kids, braces are far more uncomfortable than for others, and it really was nothing to worry about. But in fact, it was something to worry about. It turned out Kennedy was allergic to nickel, which is what her braces were made of. It was the strep infection that finally pushed things over the edge. The allergy didn't give her strep throat, but the two problems combined caused Kennedy's immune system to begin attacking her body and making her much, much sicker. That's when she started getting the headaches, the sores, and everything else. Dr. Godat told Cicely that her daughter's symptoms would have only worsened and intensified if they had not identified her nickel allergy. Left untreated, her condition could have even turned fatal. Cicely was overcome with relief. Right away, she took Kennedy to the orthodontist and got her braces removed, and within hours, Kennedy began feeling better. And soon, she would make a full recovery. One dusty summer afternoon in 2013, a man named John Lee sighed with relief as he pulled his Jeep into the driveway of his family's home in Australia. John and his family had been on a very nice weekend getaway into the outback to camp and hunt, but the whole drive back home had been an absolute horror show. His 8-year-old son Mason would not stop fidgeting and talking and fighting with his siblings, and so it made the already very long drive back home feel twice as long. The second John turned off the car, Mason flung the door open and sprinted off. John looked over at his wife, Patty, and they shared a look of absolute exhaustion. Mason had always been hyperactive, but lately his crazy energy had really ramped up. His siblings basically tolerated it, but sometimes even they seemed overwhelmed by Mason's frantic dash from one thing to the next. John got out and opened up the trunk and began unloading the car, while Patty took the kids inside. Inside the garage, John stacked the family's tents and sleeping bags in big storage tubs, and then placed his shotgun and ammunition in a standing gun rack. Finally, he carefully packed the wild geese that he'd killed into an industrial-sized freezer. He would pluck and prepare them later for future family dinners. Once everything was packed away, John went inside the house, where his wife was in the kitchen putting away food. Patty asked him if Mason was with him, but John told her that he had assumed the boy was inside with her. Patty stopped unpacking and shot John a worried look. It was never a good sign when neither of them knew what Mason was up to. John left the kitchen to go find out what sort of hyperactive mischief his son had gotten into this time. And he could hear the destruction even before he saw it. He found Mason holding a hammer, completely destroying his playhouse. And so as John stood there shocked, surveying the wreckage, he realized this couldn't wait any longer. Mason needed professional help. Later that week, John sat next to his son in the lobby of a pediatrician's office, waiting for Mason's appointment. And as they waited, Mason wouldn't stop ripping the leaves off of potted plants, and so John just handed him a magazine to tear apart instead. When the receptionist finally called for them, John and Mason followed a nurse down a hall and into an examination room. Once Mason's pediatrician, who was named Dr. Stephen Thomas, walked into the room, John explained that Mason had been acting strangely lately. The way he played had turned aggressive. He was now breaking his siblings' toys and riding his bike right through the neighbors' gardens. And so now John said, he and his wife were overwhelmed and they were worried that there might be something medically wrong with Mason. Dr. Thomas nodded and said he would order some blood tests. Then he asked Mason to sit on the examination table while a nurse came in and drew a few vials of his blood. And so while that was happening, the doctor asked John what Mason's daily life was like. What did he eat? What did he like to do? John told him the family ate a very balanced diet, including some wild game, and Mason lived a very active outdoor life, exploring the neighborhood, swimming, and playing with friends. And until recently, John said, his son had been a very normal boy. The doctor jotted down some notes and then told them to go get some lunch and come back in the afternoon when Mason's blood work would be ready. A couple hours later, John and Mason came back to the same examination room, and not long after, Dr. Thomas entered carrying printouts of Mason's results, and he told John he had some worrying news. He said Mason's blood contained dangerously elevated levels of lead. The doctor explained that lead poisoning can have very serious consequences, especially in children. High levels of lead in the blood can cause permanent mental disabilities. It can also lead to hyperactive behavior and the very kind of violent outbursts that Mason had been having. John was speechless. He couldn't imagine where or how Mason could be coming into that much contact with a toxic heavy metal. John immediately wondered if this meant his other children were also lead poisoned. Dr. Thomas asked John if their house was older, because if it was possible there was lead in the house paint. He also asked John if they maybe had some old toys or old heirlooms in the house, because those too could have lead in them. John racked his brain picturing his son's room, but all of his son's toys and furniture were all fairly new. And then also, John knew that paint used to contain high levels of lead, but their home had been built after the Australian government had cracked down on lead paint in the 1970s, and so John knew his house was safe. And so after telling the doctor this, the doctor just told John that it was extremely important that he find out where the lead was coming from and to take action to stop the exposure. And so John said he would talk it over with his wife and see what they could figure out. Early the next week, John returned home from running errands to find Patty inside of Mason's bedroom. And Mason was curled up in a ball in his bed, saying that there was a stabbing pain in his gut that wouldn't stop. Patty told John that she had given Mason tea and some fizzy water, thinking it might help settle his stomach, but neither had helped. John couldn't bear to hear his son whimper and moan like this. The boy seemed to be in far more pain than just a normal stomach ache. So John just told Patty he was going to take Mason back to the doctor. Then he scooped Mason up in his arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him out to the car. At the clinic, the receptionist waved John and Mason through to see Dr. Thomas immediately. John explained that his son had suddenly developed severe stomach pains, and so the doctor immediately sent Mason to get his stomach x-rayed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Thomas pulled up the x-rays on the computer inside of Mason's exam room. John stared at the black and white picture of his son's ribcage and his spine, and towards the bottom of the x-ray, in the middle of Mason's gut, was a scattering of small white circles. But John had no idea what they were. The doctor lowered his voice and told John he couldn't identify the quarter-inch wide objects in the x-ray either, but there were a lot of them. They were definitely metallic, and they were lodged in the lower right side of Mason's abdomen. He told John that at some point Mason must have swallowed these things, and then somehow they had gotten stuck in his intestines rather than just passing through. The doctor suspected that these objects were the things causing Mason's abdominal distress. Dr. Thomas walked over to Mason's bed and pulled up a stool and sat down, and then he asked Mason if he'd eaten anything strange recently, maybe on a dare from friends. John watched as his son opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then Mason stopped. And then Mason just shook his head and told the doctor that nope, he couldn't think of anything like that. Dr. Thomas shrugged and gave Mason a gentle pat on the leg, and then he stood up and pulled John to the side of the room. He told John that the most important thing here was for these objects to be removed immediately. They could be responsible for the lead in his system, and the longer they stayed in Mason's body, the higher the risk that they would begin to poison Mason or cause a bowel obstruction. John was feeling totally overwhelmed, but he just asked the doctor, what are the next steps then? Dr. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said Mason would need a medical-grade enema to clean his digestive tract. This was guaranteed to flush out any foreign objects. Dr. Thomas had actually already referred Mason's case to another doctor, Dr. Joseph Malouf, who would supervise the procedure. Dr. Thomas promised John that it would be quick and not at all painful for Mason. He would just feel very full. John and Patty could even be there to hold their son's hand throughout the whole thing. A couple hours later, Dr. Maloof went to his computer and opened an X-ray image of Mason's body that was taken after the intestinal flush. And the second he saw it, his jaw dropped. None of those metallic objects had even moved. They were all still right there in Mason's gut, the same as before.
Ölüme karşı koştum durdum yoktu Kimsenin haberi yok Sevene kadar beni koşturdun Zor mu sevmek böyle of Şimdi kimse görmeden Aldım valizimi düşmeden Yollar beni bekler ben seni Çok geç olmadan dönsen geri Ama bil bunu hiçbir zaman geç olmaz Olmaz sen de durmaz Yerinde taşlar oynar Hep başlar
Dr. Maloof zoomed into the image and studied the cluster of round objects. The fact that the flush hadn't worked actually got him thinking. All Mason's doctors had presumed that Mason had swallowed these little balls, and therefore they must be lodged in his digestive tract. But the boy's digestive tract was now entirely empty, so these things couldn't be in his intestines. So where were they? An idea slowly began to take shape inside of Dr. Maloof's mind. It didn't really make sense, but it was possible, and if his hunch was right, it would explain everything. However, Dr. Maloof realized that his idea was pretty risky. To find out if his idea was right, Mason would have to undergo abdominal surgery. But if they did nothing, then these metal objects could wreak havoc in Mason's body. And so Dr. Maloof weighed the risks and decided there really wasn't any more time to waste. They would go forward with the surgery. It was the best and frankly only thing they could do. Days later, a surgeon carefully made an incision into Mason's abdomen. He was glad to see that the boy's organs looked normal, with no inflammation or visible infections. Using the X-ray images as his guide, the surgeon delicately isolated a small organ from the right side of Mason's gut, Mason's appendix. And as soon as he cut the organ free and he lifted it up with his forceps, he knew this was it. The appendix was much heavier than it should have been. Setting the organ down on a tray, the surgeon slowly sliced into the tissue and struck metal. Then it happened again and again. He realized that Dr. Maloof's hunch was right. By the time the surgeon was done dissecting Mason's appendix, he had discovered 57 lead pellets. While the surgeon stitched Mason back up, Dr. Maloof took one of the pellets into the waiting room and showed it to John and Patty. John instantly recognized it. He used those small lead pellets in his shotgun to hunt wild geese, which he would then cook and feed to his family. Once Mason recovered from his surgery, Dr. Maloof asked him, why didn't you tell anyone that you were eating your father's ammunition? Mason was embarrassed, but he explained that he and his siblings played a game where they would race to see who could make the most pellets disappear the fastest. And he did it by eating handfuls of these lead pellets. And the reason Mason hadn't said anything was he was worried his father would get mad at him if he found out, so he kept it a secret. Tests revealed that Mason's siblings had also been eating shotgun pellets, and so they too had elevated levels of lead in their body. And so, just like Mason, they all also underwent a bowel flushing procedure. Yet only Mason's pellets had gotten stuck in his appendix. The other children had simply passed the shotgun pellets in their bowel movements. Dr. Maloof was mystified by how the pellets got stuck inside of Mason. Occasionally, certain foods, like the seeds of small fruit, will bypass the intestines and get lodged in the appendix, but it's highly uncommon. For something the size of a lead pellet to end up there made no sense, and for it to happen 57 times really defied all logic. Dr. Maloof never did figure it out, but fortunately, Mason still made a full recovery, and gradually his lead levels decreased back to normal. But Dr. Malouf urged John to keep a closer eye on his ammunition and to switch to pellets not made with the poisonous metal. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martin.